recent data suggests that children under 2 experience more than 9 respiratory infections every year. I'm a board-certified pediatric ICU doc, and I see firsthand how these infections first affect the kids, but how they also impact the families. So when one person gets sick, the whole squad kind of gets sick. We have parents who miss work, other siblings who miss school, and it can have a real impact on how families function. So today, I'm going to go over some evidence-based practices that you can use at home to prevent the spread of these viruses. Let's get into it. Okay, so when we talk about viruses generally, they can spread in a number of different ways, from mixing blood to vector-borne when you have mosquitoes to sexually transmitted diseases, that type of thing. But when we talk about winter viruses that commonly cause illness, talking about influenza, COVID, RSV, that type of thing, there's really 3 distinct ways that they tend to spread, and that's contact, droplet, and aerosol transmission. So to start off, let's talk about contact spread. So what does this mean? Well, the basic idea is this. If I'm sick and have RSV, for example, and I touch my nose or my eyes, and now I suddenly have RSV particles or viral particles on my hands, if I come into direct contact with another person, so I touch their hands and shake their hands or whatever, they then have that particle on their hands, and so if they touch their eyes, nose, or mouth, they're going to get it through direct contact transmission. And so the other type of spread is what we call indirect contact spread, and this is through the use of fomites. So if I touch my phone, tablet, or a mug, and then someone comes after me and touches it and gets viral particles on their hand, and then touches their nose, eyes, or mouth, then they'll get the infection through that indirect spread. So now we'll talk about how do you prevent contact transmission. And the first and best thing is don't let the virus come into contact with any of your mucous membranes. So what's a mucous membrane? Well, mucous membranes are basically tissues or soft tissue that lines the inside of our body. So most of them we can't see, but there are places like our mouth, our eyes, and our nose where you can come into contact with them. So while our skin is pretty much an impenetrable barrier that no virus is going to get into unless you have an open wound, as soon as you touch one of those mucous membranes, you're at risk of getting infected. So the first and best thing, just don't touch your nose, don't touch your eyes, and don't touch your mouth during the winter season. For people like me, that's definitely much easier said than done. I'm kind of like a fidgety dude at baseline, always messing around and doing something. But I would say, if you're able to avoid it, this is a really important thing. And I'll be honest, we'll talk about masks a little bit later, but one of the best things about masks or goggles or glasses that I think is helpful is it modifies your behavior, because it's much harder to touch your nose or touch your mouth, at least if you have a mask on. And so I found that at least very helpful. Okay, so that's the first thing. What's the second? Well, let's do proper hand washing. Okay, and then this is one pretty obvious, but wash your hands. Everyone talks about it. But I do think it's important to say, why does washing your hands help? Because this was actually pretty convincing to me when I first learned about it. So washing your hands actually does 2 things. The first is that it actually literally gets, viral or bacterial particles and dirt, places where the virus and bacteria will live, off of your hands. And so that's good. It removes soil and flushes it down the drain. But it also does a second thing. So the soap itself actually can inactivate viruses. So the details aren't critical, but just note that most of the viruses that we care about preventing transmission in are what we call enveloped viruses. And this means that there's this fatty lipid bilayer that's around them and protects them. And so if you can break up that fatty shell, then you can kill the virus. And the viruses that have that enveloped layer are the ones that we care about, like COVID, RSV, flu, even measles, chickenpox. Most of the winter viruses basically have this. And so the point here is that soap molecules themselves actually have kind of 2 ends. One end is attracted to water, and one end is attracted to fat. So that end that's attracted to fat can actually get into that envelope of the virus and break it up and destroy it. So, and then in terms of the technique, it's important, make sure you use warm water, do 20 seconds at least, maybe 30 seconds would be even better, of all surfaces of your hands. And then just remember that antibacterial soap is good, but really any soap is going to be helpful in this process. Quick note about hand sanitizer. So in general, soap and water will be better than hand sanitizer. And this is because there are certain pathogens, like Clostridium difficile comes to mind, or norovirus, where they aren't actually handled by Purell or alcohol-based hand sanitizers quite as well as soap and water. That said, if you're going to use it, make sure you use one that has at least 60% alcohol content, and it's definitely better than nothing, so I don't want to dissuade you from using it at all. People who carry these Purell things around, I think it's a really great idea and has a lot of efficacy to it. Just if you have the option between the two, you should probably wash your hands. Okay, so we're not touching our face, we're doing proper hand washing. The last thing to do to prevent contact spread is to do proper disinfecting of commonly used or hard surfaces. So what we're trying to prevent here is that indirect contact spread. So when a viral particle particle gets onto a phone or a tablet, it can remain infective for a long time. So RSV could be more than 6 hours, and there's data that influenza will be 24 to 48 hours, where you could still pick that influenza particle up and get infected from a hard surface. Okay, so this next part, I honestly don't know if this is like super common knowledge, and if it is, then everybody just like skip through this. But so the term cleaning actually means that you're using soap or detergent with the primary intention of getting dirt or organic material off the surface. Sanitizing is when you want to do that, but you also want to use chemical agents to kill bacteria. And then finally, disinfecting is probably the most powerful, where you actually want to clean, sanitize, and remove viral particles as well, so kill viruses. So we're talking about preventing viral transmission, so we'll focus on that disinfecting, and there's a critical term called contact time. Once again, this may be obvious to everybody, so I'm sorry if it is, but it was really news to me. The contact time is also called the wet time. And basically, when you take, say, a Lysol wipe or some cleaner, it's the amount of time that that cleaner needs to sit on a surface before it's dry to do whatever it's trying to do. And this is actually a really important subject. So sanitizing and disinfecting substances are actually regulated by the government, by the EPA. So it's really important to use them as they're intended, because there's strict testing that goes along with making sure they work as intended. So take Lysol, for example. It's important to see that on the label, it actually says this is a disinfecting wipe. So that means that you are going to kill bacteria and viruses if you use it appropriately. And if you actually look on the label, then you can see there's different instructions for what you want to do. So in this case, if you want to sanitize, which means to kill bacteria, then you have to allow the surface to remain wet for at least 10 seconds. If you want to disinfect, which means we want to kill viruses, then you actually have to allow the surface to remain wet for 4 minutes. And we didn't really focus on this, but if you want to kill mold or mildew, which are fungi, then you actually have to allow the surface to stay wet for up to 10 minutes. So if you're like me, I'm pretty cheap, and so when I buy these Lysol wipes, I make sure to use them to the last drop. But this is actually really important, right? So when I take out my Lysol wipe that's 2 years old and it's half dry, and I use it, it's not really doing what I think it's doing unless I allow it to have enough of the chemical liquid on it to keep that surface wet for the intended amount of time. Okay, so let's transition now to how viruses spread via droplets and aerosols, which means basically through the air. In essence, what we're talking about is when little pieces of spit or snot or whatever get into the air and then make it to someone else's mucous membrane in their eyes, nose, or mouth. Now, a critical piece of information to think about is how big is that piece of spit, because it will affect how far it can make it to infect other people. The basic idea is that droplets are less than 100 microns, but greater than 5 microns. The actual measurement doesn't matter, but on the screen is the width of a human hair, which is 70 microns, you can see for reference. But the basic idea is that if you have a droplet, then it's much bigger than an aerosol. And so a droplet comes out of your mouth or with a sneeze or a cough, and it quickly drops to the ground, usually within 2 meters or 6 feet. Aerosols, which are less than 5 microns, super, super small, they can actually come out from a cough, a sneeze, or just when you're talking, and they can make it into the air and travel much further. So the first thing I want to talk about is the 6-foot rule. So this is for preventing droplet spread. The idea is that these bigger droplets that come out from a sneeze or a cough will drop to the ground before they get to 6 feet. I'll say there's reasonable data for this. There's like a 97% reduction in the amount of viral particles that will reach you if you're 6 feet away from somebody. So I think that's a good idea. During COVID, there were some studies that suggested you could actually get away with being just 3 feet away rather than 6 feet away. But just know that a lot of the COVID data was when there was mandatory masking at schools or other public places. So take that into account when interpreting it. So if you're dealing with somebody that you can't keep that much distance from, say they're your child, for example, another thing you can do is to improve ventilation in the home. And 2 ways to do this. 1 is to crack windows, and 2 is actually to take the fan, if you have a central air conditioner, and turn it to on rather than auto, so that it actually just constantly circulates fresh air. Now, there's some reasonable data for this, and it is definitely true that it will prevent the aerosol buildup of viral particles in your home if you let them out into the environment. So improving ventilation in your home actually is pretty effective, but it can cost a lot of money if you live in a cold climate where you're just spending a lot of money on heat and letting it go out into the environment. And then 2, it's probably not great for the environment, generally speaking. So depending on your financial situation or values, you might want to skip this one, but just a thought. Okay, so let's say you can't distance, you can't ventilate the air in your home. Well, you can also make sure that you filter the air. So this is a really good one for me. For anyone who has central air conditioning or heating, it's important to check your filters for the HVAC. Make sure that they're positioned in the right direction and that you've changed them within the last 3 months. And then another thing to consider is getting what's called a HEPA filter, a high efficiency particulate air filter. These, to be called a HEPA filter, these are also regulated and you have to check, they have to be able to stop 99.97 of tiny particulate matter, less than 0.3 microns. So again, when we were talking earlier about droplets being like 5 to 100 microns, aerosols less than 5 microns, 0.3 microns is really small. And HEPA filters stop 99 99.97 of those particles. Okay, so the last thing I have to mention, which is just really cool and came out during COVID, is something called a Corey-Rosenthal box. So if you don't have central heating or air conditioning, then basically you take 4 different HEPA filters, tape them together, and then on one end of the box you put a box fan and the other a piece of cardboard. And so you've basically made this big HEPA filter unit that you could set up in a living room or bedroom and gives you access to that filtering ability even if you don't have central air or heating. Another practice that became big during COVID was creating what are called isolation zones, and this is actually pretty effective. It's where, Corey Rosenthal box may come in handy, figuring out how you want to work with your home filtration system. But if you isolate a sick person, so again, if this is your child, probably not a great option, but if it's somebody else in the home, then something to consider and showed some efficacy. So everything I talked about today, I think there's some evidence for. Like there's some evidence to say that these things can help and they're worth trying if they make sense for you and your family. That said, I do just want to say there was what's called a Cochrane review of the different interventions that could help in preventing virus spread. And this was their conclusion, and the reality is that basically even things like masks, they're not really sure if it helps at all. Hand hygiene, they think probably does, but past that, it's hard to make strong, definitive conclusions about any of these things. So my goal here really was to just kind of show you a list of things that have some evidence for them that could prevent transmission, and a lot of it depends on who else is in the home. So if there's someone who's immunocompromised, who has cancer, who has lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or something like that, then it might be important to try more of these interventions to keep them safe. And if everybody else is relatively healthy and likely to do well with a mild, viral infection, then maybe these aren't as important. So I think all of these are reasonable. I kind of end with like, okay, well, what do I do? I would say hand hygiene is probably number 1 and something I really focus on. 2 is I do sometimes wear a mask if I'm sick and don't want to get anybody else sick in my family. And then 3rd, I think HEPA filters are a reasonable thing to consider. Some of them can be a little expensive, but any HEPA filter should do and should help. And it doesn't have some of the downsides. I realize I already labeled myself as like super cheap, so of course I'm not opening my windows during the winter. But no, it doesn't have some of the downsides of the other solutions. And so I think those are 3 things that I at least say are pretty top priority. And then all of the things I mentioned here could be helpful. It just depends on you and your family situation. All right, so if you made it to the end of the video, I appreciate it and I hope that was helpful. If you have a chance to like or subscribe, of course, it would help a lot. And then more important, actually, if you're willing to leave a comment about any questions you have about pediatrics, any feedback, or any other videos that you'd like to see, just let me know because I really want to engage with people and kind of see what's on their mind and would love to help out. So thanks so much.